So welcome everybody. Thanks for joining. In Israel, we have the traditional weather for this season, which makes everybody feel stuffy. I don't know what it is about the weather at this time of year, but it's like we get this big cloud that comes from the desert, covers everything, and nobody can speak, and nobody can breathe, and nobody can hear. I guess it's some kind of preparation for Pesach. Of course, it also makes sure that after you've cleaned all the windows from all the chametz you've been eating on them all year long, now they look like they were rained on by mud. Okay, and there's no rain. It just looks that way. So you'll excuse me that I don't know how much. I'm going to sniff a lot. Okay. So our topic today is really about the Haggadah and this mitzvah that we're going to perform in 5 days of telling the Haggadah. And the Haggadah is basically what you would call a shir. It's basically somebody giving a class on the topic of the Exodus from Egypt. So like in any class that people do today, there's a source sheet. And the Haggadah is sort of like the source sheet. It's a source sheet that takes from 2 main passages in the Torah and from a lot of different sayings of the sages on these 2 main passages. So the 2 main passages are both in Deuteronomy, and we'll get to them a little bit later. The first one is dealing with the wise son who asks to know the laws of the Seder, of Pesach. And the second one, and that's related to Passover, of course. But the second one doesn't seem to be so related. The second one is about the first fruit, is bringing Bikurim, the first fruit, to the temple. And we're going to take a look at that a little bit more later. And it's going to serve as a jumping or a starting point for us to try to understand what it means that when we tell this story of the Exodus from Egypt, we're not telling a story that's history, but rather we're telling our own story. And even if we don't remember being there, we don't remember exactly what happened, we don't have a personal individual recollection, but that is many times what happens when a person goes through trauma, that there's no recollection of the events that actually happened. And it's a good thing. It's a defense mechanism that we have that's called denial, that doesn't allow us to fully experience or re-experience or remember what exactly happened. But we all know that that doesn't work in the long term. And we have to mature. We have to move from denial to something a little bit different. So the Seder is really, or the first night of Pesach, is the opportunity that we get to deal with our trauma from Egypt. Now, to say trauma from Egypt is kind of weird. It's not like we climbed the pyramids. We were there last 2 years ago on a vacation. We had to climb all the way up, and it's really difficult. None of us have actual trauma from Egypt, but we're carrying around a collective trauma that is still in us. And as a people, as individuals, I'm not going to talk so much about how we get rid of that trauma, even though we're going to take the Seder as an example. But what I want to learn from the Seder is the power of how the Torah tells us, or how the sages learned that the Torah is telling us to deal with these traumas, how to actually go through a process that can heal them, and exactly what it means to be healed from a trauma. Does it mean that the trauma is gone? Does it mean that we've turned a new leaf? Does it mean that it's over and we can go out and dance in the streets and it's all done? Or does dealing with trauma mean actually something else? And that's what we'll try to look at in this class. Okay, so let's start by looking at the Haggadah just a little bit. To look at, I'm going to share the screen here, and I'm going to use the new Haggadah that Chabad brought out. We published it this year. So here it is. It's actually cute. Not a bad effort. And maybe too cute. I don't know. Some people might say that this is going overboard already. But I just downloaded it the other day, and I thought this would be a good chance to give a little plug for it. You can get it for free on chabad.org. Okay. So let's see what we just talked about. The four sons, the first son, as we said, is his answer. What is this? What is this holiday? What are these mitzvos? What is everything we're doing? That's from Deuteronomy chapter 6. But we're not going to look at that very much. We're only going to look at the second section of the Haggadah, which is the crux of everything, which is really all about just 4 verses. 4 verses in the Torah. Surprisingly, to tell the story of the Exodus, we don't turn to the book of Exodus, which is what you might imagine would be the natural thing to do. If you're going to talk about the Exodus from Egypt, why not actually quote from the verses in the book of Exodus, the book of Shmos, where the Exodus is described? So let's look at what we do quote and learn something from that. So what we do quote is like this, and it starts here on page 42. And they did it like this. Let's see. I hope you can see it. It's kind of small, at least on my screen. I hope it's big enough for you to read on your screen. And let's see what they wrote here. They said, now we'll start telling the story of our descent to Egypt, our enslavement, and our liberation from there. We'll do that by taking 4 terse verses of Torah that pack in the entire story. Again, this is from Deuteronomy chapter 26, verses 5, 6, 7, and 8. The verses we'll use are those we would say when we brought our first fruits to the temple. So we gave a basket of produce to a Kohen, to the priest, and recited these verses to tell the story of the Exodus and to thank God for the promised land. Since everyone knew them by heart, they served as every man's Jewish history in a nutshell. So they're packed tight with meaning. So if you look at the Haggadah, you'll see now that from the moment we begin quoting these 4 verses, and Aramean was out to annihilate my father. Eventually, he went down to Egypt. He was visiting there with very few people, but he ended up becoming a mighty people there, powerful and populous. The Egyptians treated us badly, and they made us suffer, and they assigned us hard work. And we cried out to God, the God of our fathers, and God heard our voice and saw our suffering, our labor, and our oppression. And God took us out of Egypt with a strong hand, with an outstretched arm, with a huge spectacle, with signs, and with wonders. Those are the 4 verses. It takes a long time because, like in any source sheet, we bring the verses, but then we begin to bring everything that the sages have to say about these verses. And there's a lot. The Haggadah doesn't bring everything, but it brings quite an amount of detail. So from page 42 in this Haggadah, all the way, so the first 2 pages are the first verse, then what they call here part 2 is the second verse, the third verse, and the 4th verse. And then the end of the 4th verse is, and with wonders. And what are we talking about with wonders? So we're talking about the plagues, all the plagues that happened, everything that happened on the sea. And then we go into a long exposition about the plagues and what happened on the Red Sea. And that takes up a few more pages. And And finally, we're done. And then come the two short, well, some people sing, Dayenu, and then there's another song of blessing, which is called Alachat Kama V'Chama, and we're basically done with the Magid. We're done with the major part of the Seder night, which is all the recitation that we do. Why did whoever compiled the Haggadah choose these 4 verses? So they said above that it's because they're very terse and they have the whole story in 4 verses. But if that's the story, then let's turn for a second to the actual verses and notice that whoever compiled the Haggadah left out the 5th verse. And the 5th verse is about, well, I'll read it for you. The fifth verse is, and he brought us to this place and gave us this land, a land flowing with milk and honey. That's the 5th verse, and it's also said as part of the first fruit ceremony. Why is this not in the Haggadah? Why was this dropped? There's no reason to drop it. It's not wrong. It's part of the story. The Exodus didn't really finish until we came to the land of Israel. So why is it not in the Haggadah? There's all kinds of answers that were given to this question. But in our context, I think that the most interesting answer is that we have to imagine who are the first people to say these verses, these 5 verses, when they brought first fruit. They were the generation that entered the land of Israel. But this was not the same generation that left Egypt. Because remember that after they left Egypt, they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. And the people that were alive in Egypt did not get to go into the land of Israel. So the people that said these 5 verses for the first time, by the way, they didn't need a temple to be built. They said it after 14 years of being in the land of Israel because the first fruit was first brought to the tabernacle. The tabernacle was erected in Shiloh during the years before the temple was constructed in Jerusalem. So they brought it to the tabernacle. So the people that brought it were the grandchildren of those who had left Egypt. So how can they say in the first person, again, let's read these verses, they say in the first person, an Aramean was out to annihilate my father. Eventually he went down to Egypt. He was visiting there with very few people, but he ended up becoming a mighty people. They were powerful and populous. The Egyptians treated us badly, and they made us suffer. And we cried out to God, and God took us out of Egypt, and so on. So how can the people who weren't in Egypt say this? It's not true. God didn't take them out. He brought them to the land of Israel. That's true. The 5th verse is true. But the first 4 verses, how can they say it in the first person? How can that be? Because, like we began, and let me read it now for you, on page 57 here, and we all say it right after we finish these verses. In every single generation, every person has to see him or herself, himself or herself, as though he or she actually left Egypt. That's what it says. And you shall tell the story to your child on that day, saying, so that I would do all this, the Seder, and tell this story. That's why God did all that for me when I left Egypt. It wasn't just our ancestors that God liberated from Egypt. He liberated us along with him. Like it says, it was us that he took out from there so that he can bring us here to give us the land that he promised to our ancestors. That's already from the other main section of Torah that's quoted, the answer to the wise son. The answer to the wise son actually ends here, and the next thing you do is you wash, you do the second cup, and then you wash to eat the matzah. So the answer to the second son finishes everything, and it gives an incredible answer. It says, why are we doing this? We're doing this because we came out of Egypt. There's something in us that is experiencing and going through the exodus from Egypt on this night. Now, that's the tricky thing about trauma. The tricky thing is, like we said in the beginning, that a person doesn't remember and doesn't fully recollect what happened to them. It's very difficult to come to terms with what actually happened. What's the answer, says the Torah? The answer is that you tell the story. You have to be able to narrate the story. You have to come to a point where you can retell what happened. If you can't do that, then the trauma is not finished. What makes trauma manageable? The ability to come to terms with the fact that this is what my life is. That's the most difficult part of it. What is the normal reaction to something that's impossible to handle, impossible to carry, impossible to suffer? It's denial. It didn't happen to me. And that causes all the problems in the psyche. If you can't come to terms with what your life is about, then you suffer from everything that happened in it. But to come to terms doesn't mean solving the trauma. That's the big lesson from everything that we just said. The reason that we say this in the first person, the reason we reenact this, is because the very ability to admit to myself, to tell the story, is what's needed in order to heal trauma. Trauma is not necessarily solved when, for instance, the person who perpetrated the trauma is punished. A lot of people that went through abuse or anything like that, and they saw the perpetrator being punished, didn't find the solace they were looking for. They didn't find the resolution they were looking for. It's very interesting that 3,300 years after the trauma that the Egyptians inflicted on us, we don't describe just the end of the Egyptians. We tell the whole story. Because you have to be able to admit that the story actually happened. You have to be willing to voice it. You have to be willing to make it into effect. So for 3,300 years, Jews every single year go through the same motions again, telling the same story again. What is there to tell? Because it's a very interesting thing that when the trauma is, call it, resolved, it becomes part of life. It not only becomes part of life, it becomes empowering. It becomes the seed from which life sprouts, one might say. It's on this night when we say the Haggadah that we become the people that we are. We're not the Jewish people in spite of having been in Egypt. We're the Jewish people because we were in Egypt. We're not who we are because we got over what happened. We're who we are because we remember what happened. Trauma serves a purpose. Any kind of difficulty that a person experiences in life that is truly hard is not meant to be resolved by being forgotten. It's meant to be resolved by being incorporated, by being integrated into life. This is a really a very powerful lesson. But the sign that I've truly been able to integrate what happened to me is that I can retell the story. I can retell it. Does it make me proud? Maybe. Maybe I'm proud about the fact that I was able to endure it. I was able to get through it. Maybe I'm proud about the fact that I was able to rebuild my life afterwards. I can find many things to be a source of satisfaction in a certain sense after the fact. That this is what my life looks like now. It doesn't mean that I'll stop being plagued by the past. The way to transform the past into something that's empowering is to be able to write it up, to say it, to voice it as a story that made me who I am, that turned me into what I am now. For that, I first of all have to love what I am now. I have to feel joy at it, that this is who I want to be. I have to embrace everything that this made me into. Until I can tell the story, until I can perform what the Torah calls the mitzvah, v'yigadeta levincha bayom hahu, you shall say to your children on that day, say to your child on that day. Until I can bring it to that state, I haven't fully recovered from the trauma. But here's the amazing thing, that we think about recovery, we think about health, we think about healing. We think about these things as moving from one state to another state. If before I was perfectly fine, then something happened, whatever that thing was. When I turn out at the other side, I keep having a wish. I wish I could go back to where I was before. Everything was fine before that happened, whatever that was. I was fine. And so my goal becomes in my head, again, this is very natural. My goal becomes, I want to go back to being what I was like before. The Torah is, I think, trying to say that you can't go back. How far back do you want to go? Do you want to go before Egypt? So guess what happened before Egypt? We were running away from an Aramean who wanted to annihilate us. There we're talking about Laban trying to pursue Jacob to kill him. You want to go back further? How much further do you want to go back? Well, it must have been good in the time of Abraham. No, it wasn't so great back then either. Because, as we read in the Haggadah, in the beginning, our forefathers were idolaters. What made us into who we are? Exactly those things that we might be trying to run away from. Those things shifted us. They changed us. They didn't let us stay the way we were. So we idealize the past in some way, the long, far away past, and we imagine that that's the future that we want to arrive at. That we'd like to go back to the state of being whole before we were traumatized. But the truth is that only God can do that. And he does that. A lot of times it's done to people. When is it done? When does it happen? I believe it happens after a person is able to take the trauma, to take the history, to take the past, and not ignore it, and not try to deny it, but rather be able to incorporate it into the present, into who they are, understanding that this is what made me into who I am. And so in the end, we give praise. This is a very difficult concept. To tell the story is the first stage before giving thanks for everything that happened. This is a very difficult thing to come to terms with. It almost sounds like superhuman. Here, and it's right. I'm not sure that everybody can come to this state, and I'm not sure that everybody can do it quickly. You can't set it as a goal. But once it happens, once you're able to say, thank you, Hashem, for everything that happened to me, including all the difficult things that happened, that's when the past has been incorporated into the future. It's when the past is no longer something that I'm trying to run away from, but it becomes the foundation upon which my future is built. It's what informs the direction in which I want to go. It gave me what I am. I have to learn how to tell the story the right way. I have to learn how to tell the story in such a way that the trauma is not resolved by the story. Rather, the story is a continuous retelling. It's a continuous act that deals with it again and again and again, as we do with the Exodus every year, again and again, the same thing. What does this mean? It means really that we're not looking to arrive at a new state. It's not like going back to being the way I was before. Rather, to deal with the trauma, I have to create what I would call a new way of behavior. Dealing with trauma is not getting from point A to point B, but rather creating a behavioral scheme that deals with it on a continual basis. For instance, a lot of people that experience the trauma afterwards have all kinds of personality issues. Personality issues will a lot of times be some kind of psychosis. They could be all kinds of things that happen. For instance, OCD is very common. A sense of wanting to control. OCD is like a surrogate for trying to control my life in a place where I feel that I had lost control. So it's a behavioral pattern that allows us to contain the pain in the trauma. Except that instead of it being something negative, it can turn into something positive. So for instance, when you look at how we deal with the exodus from Egypt, the bondage in Egypt and so on, how do we deal with it? OCD. That's exactly what we do. A lot of people, and this is actually the response, that the way that we clean, the way that we act before Passover is actually acting out an OCD type of behavior. It's obsessive and it's compulsive. Is it good? Yes, because it's a behavior that allows us to contain what happened. It's not, the trauma is not resolved by suddenly coming to the state where I don't care anymore. I do care. And it does pain me. And I have to act a certain way in order to contain, in order to be able to hold myself and not fall apart. So I do OCD, that's fine. It's actually a very deep concept. There's a lot of people that try to tell people, look, don't go overboard in Pesach cleaning. Don't do that. It's not good for you. You're not OCD. You shouldn't be that way. But what they miss is that the fact that we do go overboard is actually part of dealing with what we need to deal with. Of course, since we're doing it as, call it in a clinical setting, because we don't really need the house to be sparkling clean. It's not really the halacha. It's not really the law. We're doing it as sort of like a therapy. So when you do something as a therapy, you don't have to get uptight about it. You don't have to really yell at the kids. You don't have to bring them as a sacrifice instead of the Paschal lamb. You don't have to do any of these things. You can just be normal. But it's not a bad thing to be obsessive, as long as you're obsessive about it yourself. I once heard a great story from Reb Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, that this young man and his wife came to him. And the young man, they were married maybe a year or two, and this was the first Pesach they were cleaning, I guess. First time they left the home and sold it and just went to one of their parents. The second time they actually cleaned. So the young man says to Reb Shlomo, we have a problem. I say that you have to clean the gaps between the flooring, right? Whether it's in Israel where the flooring is like tiles, or in America where you've got wooden flooring. So I learned that you have to clean everything there. And the wife says, we never did this in my house. Is it really necessary? So Reb Shlomo was very, very wise. He looks at them and he says to the man, he's right. It needs to be done. You need to do it very carefully. But because it needs to be done so carefully, he says, can you wait outside a second? I want to explain to him how it needs to be done. So the wife leaves and he tells the man, look, this is one of the most important parts of koshering for Pesach. It needs to be done, but you can't trust your wife. So you have to do it. It's a great way. Apparently, if somebody comes and asks you, do I need to clean the gap between the tiles on my floor? They need it. They need it for something. Something's bugging them. Something needs to be contained. So if you're smart, you say, yes, you do need to do this, but just to make sure that he's the only one who's going to do this OCD act and he's not going to drive anybody else crazy with him. That's the nature of dealing with these things. There is some behavioral aspect that has to be done. But the actions are only a lead up to the actual storytelling. The storytelling is where it's really at. That after you've gone through the different behaviors that allow you to contain it, the true sublimation of the denial, of the pain, of the effect that this had on you is through the storytelling. It's through the ability to see yourself in that place and to tell the story, and in the end to be able to say, thanks to God for everything that happened. When that happens, when a person can say that, then he knows that he's in Geula, that he's now in redemption. It's almost certain that the moment that you can say that all the troubles will be gone. But you have to be able to tell the story. You have to be able to relive it, to go through it, to feel it, to experience it again. But you're doing it in a clinical setting, one would say, in a therapeutic setting. And that signals that you have the tools to now incorporate what happened and to turn it into something positive, into something that defines you and not something that pains you. It could continue to cause some pain, but it becomes clear that I would never have given this up. I would never have said that I could be who I am without this. I needed this in order to define myself. And that's where the transition really happens. And that's what we do on the Seder night. We come and we say to our children, to ourselves, to everybody who's willing to hear and listen, that this was a traumatic experience. It was terrible. It was 210 years of terrible trauma. But the result was that we became a people. The result was that we were fashioned, we were forged into what we are. And so not only are we not running away from it, we're embracing it. We're able to tell the story. And again, the story was told right away. Right away, because you need to be able to tell. You need to be able to recount. You have to be able to recall in order to integrate, in order to sublimate, in order to be able to deal with something. There's an amazing thing that human beings everywhere know this. This is the secret of being a human being. The memorials we set up for different things, the recollections that we have, they're universal. All human beings do it. Everybody has memorials for things that happened. Why do we do this? We do this because it's a part of healing. We do this because that's how you heal. You heal through the memory. You heal through being able to tell the story. But again, the last part is the most important. That it's really healed when you can say, and this is what made me into who I am. And I thank you, God, for being who I am. Because I wouldn't want to have lived any other life. This is the life that I wanted. So, since we're very close to Passover, this will be shorter than the usual. It's not a big idea, but I think it's a very deep one. And I think it takes time to come to terms with it. And if it strikes anybody right now as something that they would want to talk about or share something about, so very happy to hear it. Let me just stop the share, and then I can hopefully let people unmute. Okay, Ilana?
I wanted to ask you things like EMDR to take away, basically takes away one's trauma. So as a Jewish person, do you want to do that? Like, are you? It seems to work like really, really well. Are you just getting rid of the trauma, or maybe it's helping a person process it quicker,
Okay,
or maybe
so
it's taking the shock out of the body so that they can think about the story.
right. So I don't think that it's dealing with the trauma. I think it's more like Tylenol. It masks the difficulty of dealing with it. It lowers the intensity. Sometimes they can be used in a positive way if you're going through other therapies.
Okay, thank you so much.
But if it's just used by itself, like Tylenol, and there's something serious underneath, I don't think it's going to lead to any kind of ability to cope and to come to some kind of resolution about it.
So it's you see people though who've gone for these things and picked their lives or just carried on. They've just carried on living. Their diseases have gone away.
Okay. I mean, I don't argue with things that work for. It's just again, it's like most.
Could it not be that it's taking the current, the trauma's going on in the person's head again and again and again? Could it not be that it's interrupting that so that a person can actually think about it without being traumatized at the same time?
Right, of course. That's what I mean. If it's dulling the intensity and allowing you to work, I think it's a very positive thing. If it's completely masking it and you think it's gone away, I have my doubts. I mean, I wish it were that easy, but I mean, I would. If it works for somebody, I'm never going to tell them, look, you're cheating yourself. It's not going to work. I would never say that. But I have my doubts. From experience, I don't think it lasts for a long time.
May I say something here?
Sure.
Thank you. So it's very interesting when one looks at the Rambam and sees the methodology, the process which they deal with a woman that's either been seduced, or there's a difference, and or raped. It's very interesting. The rapist has to marry. It's forced to marry and if the woman chooses, right? And then they can never divorce. He never can give her a get. It's very interesting because when you look at early Freud, when he was the biochemist before he became, the analytical, the went into all the analysis. In the early days when he was more of a scientist, Freud spoke about this. It was very interesting. He spoke about his idea was you meet the rapists and you kill off one confronts and dominates, if you will, kills off or dominates, right? It was all a power, domination, manipulation, the triangle, yeah. So it's very interesting when you look at the Gemara. Maybe you can say something about that. I mean, this is this flies in the face of all the stuff that I learned and all the stuff that people have learned. I don't know, Freudians, Jungians, whatever, Skinnerians, but this flies in the face of everything. This is like mamash, like you marry the rapist. I think it's genius, really.
So first of all, it's not just the Rambam. The Torah says this. That
yeah.
The way that we explain it in Chassidus is that the difficulty with any trauma, but especially with rape, is that you become victim. And to restore a victim's will to live, and they're feeling that they have something to do in life, that they have a narrative, that they have a reason for life. You have to empower them. They have to stop being a victim. So
Right, and they get compensation. The woman gets compensation, which says to me that someone is cognizant, is thinking that she needs the compensation. I think it's tremendous. It's really genius.
So compensation is only part of it, like you said.
Right.
The most important thing is that she now has, if she wants, if she's able to deal with it, she now has power over her estate.
Right. Well, she's not a victim. She's not stuck in that, I'm a victim, you know, of my circumstances. There's nothing I can do, you know.
When people think about this, it seems to them horrendous. How could you tell a woman you have the option to marry the person who
aggressively hurts you? And
but in the depth of the psyche, in some cases, that's the only option. That's the only thing that will restore life. It's very hard to see it at first. Because most people would, like I said, they will try to forget about it. They'll try to deal with it by saying, I want to be whole like I was before. But in a certain sense, you can't bring that wholeness back. The Torah doesn't say for a moment that a woman who was raped has to do this. Definitely does not have to.
No, she has a choice.
But if she feels that that is her way of gaining control back over the situation, then that's an option that's allowed.
And is that reforming the male also? He's reformed also through this process.
Hopefully.
Yeah.
Hopefully that's what it's supposed to do.
Right. I know. It's like, wow. That's like, ooh.
Let's take that to our Seder. And if in the time, somebody asked her what happens if the rapist is married. In the time of the Torah, a man could have more than one wife. But of his wives, she would be the most important. She would become the most important because she's the only one that he has no control over. And she basically, in a certain sense, controls him. So again, it all depends on the situation, and I would never do this without a real sage accompanying this process, because you really need a lot of hand-holding in this. But sometimes it's the only way to get out. But let's take this to the Seder. What we've done is that our abusers, our tormentors, are now under us. You need to see that. You need to be able to see how you suddenly have control over the situation. You have to stop being the victim. And thank you for bringing that up, because I didn't mention it here, because it's another huge topic about what it means to stop being a victim, because this is the number one problem that everybody has, even if they haven't been traumatized. Even people who have never gone through trauma today are all victims. We all feel that we're victims. We're victims of chance, of God, of society, of Corona, of who knows what. There's no end to it. To lead a free life, you have to stop being the victim. And the only way to do that is by embracing your circumstances and not to be victimized by them, whatever the circumstances are. The greatest people in the world had terrible circumstances, and yet that didn't stop them. Yeah, in my formative years, I spent a lot of time with Rav Steinsaltz, and his life was difficult. I mean, I'm talking about every single day is a struggle, a real struggle, because of his health. His health was terrible. And it started when he was 25. It wasn't like, he came to age 70 and he started losing his health. He spent his whole life battling for every moment. But look at what he accomplished. I'm not saying every single person has his capacity. When I shared with him my problems, he looked at me and he sort of like said, well, you're going to have to carry them. Carry it. Find a way to carry it. He didn't make it into a big deal. It's just something you're going to have to carry. Figure it out. Don't be a victim of it. Because there are many great things that you can do that you give yourself an excuse because of your victimization mentality. And you have to come out of it.